It was a crisp evening when the restaurant's glass doors opened, letting in a gust of cool air. Inside, the atmosphere was warm, with soft lighting and the low hum of conversations. The tables were set with care, each one featuring pristine white tablecloths and sparkling silverware. This was a place known for its elegance, where wealthy patrons often came to dine in style. The maître d', a well-dressed man with a welcoming smile, greeted every guest with a level of attention that made everyone feel like royalty. At the corner table, a woman stepped in, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she walked toward her seat. Her presence was immediately noticed. She was well-dressed in a sleek black dress that screamed sophistication, her hair styled in a polished bun, and her face adorned with a thick layer of makeup. She exuded the kind of confidence that only comes from wealth and privilege. The kind of confidence that made her believe she could get away with anything, and that everything and everyone was beneath her. As she sat down, she scanned the room, her eyes briefly meeting those of a few patrons before turning away dismissively. The waiter who approached her table was young, dressed in a neatly pressed uniform that contrasted with the luxury of the surroundings. He wore a soft smile, his eyes filled with a quiet professionalism as he introduced himself. "Good evening, ma'am. Welcome to our restaurant. My name is Jordan, and I'll be taking care of you this evening. May I start you off with a drink?" The woman looked him up and down, her gaze lingering on his uniform. A flicker of something, maybe disdain or simply indifference, flashed across her face. She seemed to size him up, deciding whether he was worthy of her attention. The way she looked at him made it clear she didn't see him as a person, just a figure who served her. "I'll have a glass of your finest wine," she said with a tone that wasn't just polite but almost patronizing. "And please make sure it's something good, not like the cheap stuff they serve at those other places." Jordan nodded, trying his best to maintain his composure despite the woman's tone. "Of course, ma'am. I'll bring it right over." As he walked away, the woman muttered something under her breath, too quiet for him to hear but loud enough for the nearby diners to catch. "Can't even get proper service around here," she grumbled, her words just loud enough for Jordan to hear. The comment stung, but he held his head high and walked toward the wine cellar, trying not to let her words affect him. Meanwhile, the woman settled back into her chair, running her fingers along the edge of the table. She was clearly in her element here, surrounded by opulence while the people around her seemed like mere figures in the background. As she glanced at the menu, she was already imagining how much better her evening would be compared to others in the room. After all, people like her didn't belong in the same world as the waitstaff. They were there to serve her, not to be a part of her experience. When Jordan returned with the wine, he poured it into her glass with practiced precision. The woman didn't even glance at him, her attention fixed firmly on the menu in front of her. She picked up the glass and took a small sip, swishing it around in her mouth as though she were a wine expert, evaluating every note. She then placed the glass back down and finally looked at him. "Is this the best you have?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. Jordan was taken aback by the question. He had brought her one of the restaurant's most expensive options, a vintage bottle known for its exceptional quality. Still, he kept his tone neutral. "It's one of our finest, ma'am. If you'd prefer something different, I'd be happy to suggest another option." The woman's lips curled into a faint smile, almost like a smirk. "I don't think you understand what I mean," she said, leaning back in her chair and placing her hands on her lap as if to further distance herself from him. "I'm used to finer things. You'd be surprised what real luxury tastes like. But I'm sure you've never had the privilege of knowing, have you?" Jordan felt a brief flash of heat rise to his cheeks, but he quickly suppressed it. He had heard these kinds of remarks before. People like her often saw themselves as better than others, but he wasn't about to let her get to him. He simply nodded. "I assure you, ma'am, I only aim to make your experience here the best it can be." "Experience? You mean service, don't you?" She snapped, her tone sharp now. "I don't care about your experience. I care about my own. It would be nice if you remembered who's really in charge here." The word stung, but Jordan's face remained unchanged. His job wasn't to argue. It was to serve. So with a professional smile, he nodded and turned to leave. The woman watched him go, shaking her head slightly. She muttered to herself again, not caring if he heard. "Unbelievable. This place is supposed to be top tier, and yet the staff—" But her words trailed off as her gaze wandered around the room. She tried to focus on something else, anything else but the restaurant, The quiet hum of conversations and the soft clinking of glasses seemed to heighten the tension. There was a brief moment when the silence became uncomfortable, but she quickly pushed it away with a new thought. After all, she was paying for this, and that meant everything. As the night went on, the woman continued to complain. The food wasn't up to her standards, the lighting was too dim, and the music wasn't the kind of sophisticated classical tunes she was accustomed to. Jordan kept his distance but never strayed too far. He knew how to handle difficult customers. He had been trained for this, and no matter how rude or dismissive they were, his job was to ensure they had everything they needed. When he returned to check on her later, she barely acknowledged his presence. Instead, she gestured toward her plate with a dismissive wave. "This doesn't taste like anything," she said, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at the food. "Do you even know what real fine dining is?" Jordan had heard enough. He had dealt with people like her before, and he wasn't about to let her continue to belittle him. He took a deep breath, forced a smile, and said, "I'll have the kitchen prepare something else for you." The woman smirked, thinking she had won. Good. Finally someone who knows how to do their job. Maybe there's hope for this place after all. Jordan nodded and walked away, trying not to let her words sink in. He had learned not to take things personally, but tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way she spoke to him as if he was nothing more than a servant. He had seen it before, but tonight her arrogance stung more than usual. Little did she know. The night was far from over, and her behavior was about to take a turn she would never expect. The woman's complaints didn't stop after the food was replaced. It seemed like nothing could satisfy her. Jordan had returned with a different dish, one that he hoped would meet her standards. But as she took a bite, her face twisted into a scowl. The food was still not up to her high expectations. "This is still terrible," she muttered, pushing the plate away from her. "How hard is it to get a decent meal around here? Do I look like someone who'd settle for this?" Jordan stood quietly beside her table, trying to maintain his professionalism despite the constant barrage of insults. He had seen customers like her before, people who believed they could demand anything and everything just because they had money. They were entitled, often dismissive, and believed that their money gave them the right to treat others however they pleased. He nodded politely, keeping his voice calm. "I'm very sorry, ma'am. If you'd like, I can speak with the chef and have something else prepared." The woman didn't even look up at him. She was scanning the room, eyes moving over the other diners with barely concealed judgment. Her lips parted, about to complain again, but something made her pause. She seemed to spot a couple seated across the room, and her eyes narrowed as she studied them for a moment. She turned back to Jordan, her tone suddenly colder, almost calculating. "What kind of place is this? You almost think you're better than the others, don't you? Look at that couple over there, acting like they're so special just because they can afford a dinner like this. Do you really think I want to sit in a room full of people like that?" Jordan felt the weight of her words, but he didn't allow himself to react. Instead, he kept his tone steady, trying to diffuse the situation. "Ma'am, we aim to make every guest feel comfortable here, no matter who they are." The woman scoffed, as though his words were absurd. "Comfortable?" she repeated with a sneer. "I'm not here for comfort. I'm here for perfection. And this," she gestured to the table with exaggerated contempt, "this is not perfection. It's a joke." The rest of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background. Jordan was used to handling difficult customers, but tonight felt different. The woman's attitude was not just rude, it was dismissive, as though she didn't even see him as a person. He could feel the sting of her words, but he refused to let her see it. He was trained to handle situations like this with poise and patience. As he turned to leave, he noticed a few of the other guests glancing in his direction. They seemed uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. It was as though they were all too intimidated by the wealthy woman's presence to intervene. He was alone in this moment, and it didn't bother him as much as it used to. He had learned that people like her rarely ever cared about the people they belittled, and that was something he had come to accept. A few moments passed before the woman's voice cut through the air again. "Are you just going to stand there?" she asked, her tone now sharp with impatience. "Do you even know how to do your job properly?" Jordan turned back, forcing a smile despite the tightness in his chest. "I apologize, ma'am. I'll make sure to take care of everything for you." But the woman didn't respond to him. Instead, she picked up her glass of wine, swirled it absent-mindedly, and stared out the window, her attention somewhere far away. She wasn't even trying to hide the fact that she had already decided that he was unworthy of her time. The restaurant continued to hum around him, the soft conversations of the other patrons blending together with the clink of silverware and the faint background music. But it all seemed to be happening at a distance, as though he were watching from the sidelines. Jordan knew this job wasn't easy, but tonight felt harder. The woman's words stuck with him, and as he returned to the kitchen to pass on the request for a new dish, he found himself thinking about how people like her never truly understood the effort it took to make everything work behind the scenes. The chef quickly got to work on the new dish, but Jordan's mind kept drifting back to the woman. He couldn't help but wonder how she could be so cruel to someone who was just doing his job. The way she spoke to him, as if he were beneath her, was a reminder of how little some people thought of others who weren't in their social circle. He had heard the same kind of condescension from wealthy customers before, but tonight something about it felt more personal. She wasn't just a rude customer. She was someone who seemed to think that people like him were insignificant, unworthy of basic respect. As Jordan brought the new dish to her table, he prepared himself for more complaints. But to his surprise, the woman barely looked at him when he placed the plate down. Instead, she let out an exaggerated sigh, her eyes scanning the room once more. Finally, she muttered, "Something decent. Let's see if it's any good." She took a bite, chewed slowly, and then, after a long pause, she set her utensils down with a clink. "This is better. But you're still not impressing me," she added, her voice as cold as ever. Jordan nodded and turned to walk away, but just before he did, he heard her voice again. "You know, it's funny," she said, her tone changing slightly. "I come here thinking this is going to be a special night, and instead I'm dealing with this. You'd think a place like this would have higher standards." He didn't turn around. He simply nodded, his jaw clenched as he walked toward the kitchen. The night dragged on in the same uncomfortable pattern. The woman continued to find fault with everything around her, from the decor to the lighting to the service. And all the while, Jordan remained composed, his smile never faltering despite the growing frustration within him. He had learned to be patient with difficult customers, but tonight felt like something more, something that was wearing him down bit by bit. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about the way she saw him and everyone else around her, as if they were simply there to serve her whims. He couldn't shake the feeling that her attitude wasn't just about her dissatisfaction with the food. It was about something deeper, a belief that people like her could treat others however they wanted without consequence. She thought she could throw her weight around and get whatever she wanted, and tonight she had made it clear that no one was exempt from her judgment. But Jordan wasn't going to let her get to him. He had been in the service industry long enough to know that people like her came and went. They could make a scene, they could demand attention, but in the end, they would leave and the restaurant would continue to run smoothly, just as it always had. The night wasn't over yet, and Jordan had no idea just how much longer he would have to endure the woman's behavior. But he had made it this far, and he wasn't about to let her ruin his sense of professionalism. As the night went on, the tension in the restaurant seemed to rise with every passing minute. The woman at the corner table, still dissatisfied with everything, continued to make pointed remarks, her voice carrying across the room at times. Each time Jordan approached her table, he braced himself for the same condescending remarks, the same dismissive tone. He knew the routine by now. She would never be happy, no matter what he did. But even as he prepared himself for her usual complaints, something in the air seemed different. The other guests, though polite, had become visibly uncomfortable with her behavior. Their glances, quickly averted when she looked their way, spoke volumes. No one dared to speak up, not even when she raised her voice. But it was clear from the way they shifted in their seats that they were all silently wishing she would leave. Jordan, though, wasn't concerned with the other diners. His focus was solely on doing his job and maintaining his professionalism. After all, that was what mattered most. But deep down, he couldn't shake the growing frustration inside him. It was one thing to have to deal with difficult customers, but it was another to be belittled repeatedly in front of other people. And this woman, who seemed to think she could treat anyone as she pleased, was testing his patience in ways he hadn't expected. When Jordan returned to the table to check on her, she barely acknowledged him. Her eyes were still scanning the room, her face set in a look of complete indifference. The moment he arrived, she lazily waved a hand in his direction without lifting her gaze. "You," she said, her voice lacking any warmth. "Come here for a second. I need something." Jordan stood still for a moment, unsure of what to expect. She had been so difficult all night that he didn't know if she was about to complain or demand something else. His hand instinctively reached for his notepad, prepared to take her latest request. "Yes, ma'am?" he asked politely. She finally looked at him, her gaze cold but calculating. "I need to speak to the manager now." Jordan paused for a moment. He had been hoping to avoid escalating the situation further, but it seemed inevitable now. If she wanted the manager, that's what she'd get. "I'll get him for you, ma'am," he replied evenly, trying his best to maintain his composure. "Please excuse me for a moment." As Jordan walked away, he couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in his stomach. The woman had made it clear that she wasn't satisfied, and now it seemed like she wanted to take things to another level. But as he approached the kitchen, he was determined to keep the situation under control. He would inform the manager, and they would deal with it as professionally as possible. The manager was in the back, checking on a few things in the kitchen. When Jordan approached, he immediately saw the concern on Jordan's face. "What's going on?" the manager asked, already sensing that something wasn't right. Jordan explained the situation quickly. "She's been making a lot of complaints all night, sir. I've done my best to accommodate her, but now she's asking to speak with you." The manager nodded, his expression thoughtful. "All right, I'll handle it. Thanks for letting me know." Jordan, though relieved to be out of the firing line, still felt a sense of unease. He had no idea what the woman would say to the manager. But one thing was clear: she wasn't going to let this go easily. A few minutes later, the manager approached the woman's table. He had a calm, collected demeanor, his presence one that commanded respect without the need for words. The woman's eyes followed him as he approached, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Well, finally," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "It took long enough to get someone who knows how to handle things around here." The manager didn't respond to her jabs. Instead, he simply introduced himself. "Good evening, ma'am. I'm the manager. I understand you've had some concerns tonight." "How can I help?" The woman immediately launched into her complaints, listing everything that had gone wrong in her mind. The food wasn't up to par, the lighting was too dim, the atmosphere was lacking, and of course there was the issue of the service. Specifically, the waiter who had ruined her experience. The manager listened carefully, nodding every so often to acknowledge that he was paying attention. When she finally finished, the manager gave a polite but firm response. "I'm sorry to hear you're dissatisfied. We strive to provide the best experience for all our guests, and I apologize that we haven't met your expectations. I'll make sure we address everything you've mentioned. Is there anything else I can do for you?" The woman didn't seem satisfied with this response. She was expecting more, something more dramatic, something that would show her just how important she was. She wanted him to apologize profusely, to beg for her forgiveness for the terrible experience she believed she had suffered. But the manager wasn't playing her game. Instead, he was focused on finding a solution, not pandering to her. "You don't understand," she snapped, leaning forward. "I am a regular here. I know the owners. I don't expect this kind of treatment. This place used to be better. It's gone downhill." The manager's demeanor didn't change. He remained calm, his expression neutral. "I see. Well, I can assure you that we value all of our guests, whether they're regulars or first-timers. But I also believe that every person deserves respect regardless of their status. If you'd like to discuss your concerns further, I'd be happy to speak with you privately." The woman froze for a moment, clearly taken aback by the manager's words. She had expected him to crumble under her influence, to give in to her demands. But instead he was standing his ground, offering her the same level of respect he expected in return. For a brief second, she didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to being treated like this. In her world, she was accustomed to being the one in control, to having the power to make people bend to her will. But this manager wasn't playing along with her usual tactics. "I'll think about it," she said curtly, her gaze flickering away from the manager as she dismissed him. The manager didn't press her further. Instead, he gave a slight nod and turned to walk away, confident that he had handled the situation with professionalism. But as he walked back toward the kitchen, he couldn't help but notice how the other diners had been watching from the corners of their eyes. They had been observing the interaction, but none of them had dared to speak up. Jordan, now standing near the kitchen door, watched as the woman sat back in her chair, Her arms crossed and her lips pursed. She looked like she was fuming, but for the first time that night she seemed to have been knocked off her pedestal. The sense of superiority that had marked her behavior all evening was gone, replaced by something else, something less certain. The manager returned to the kitchen, where Jordan was still waiting. He glanced at Jordan, giving him a small but meaningful nod. "She's been dealt with," he said quietly. "But I have a feeling we haven't heard the last of her." Jordan nodded in agreement. He wasn't sure how the night would unfold from here, but one thing was certain: it was far from over. The atmosphere in the restaurant grew quieter after the manager's conversation with the woman. Her mood had shifted from the fiery anger she'd displayed earlier to a more subdued, almost calculating silence. For a moment it seemed like the tension had broken, but Jordan, still moving through the restaurant, could feel that something wasn't right. He had a sense that this wasn't over. The woman wasn't just upset about the food or the service. There was something more, something deeper. As the evening wore on, Jordan went about his work, but his mind kept drifting back to her table. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about the way she had acted earlier didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, like she was used to being in control, used to getting what she wanted without question. He had seen people like her before. The ones who thought their wealth and status gave them a free pass to treat others however they pleased. But there was something about this woman that made him uneasy. A few hours passed and the restaurant began to wind down. Most of the guests had finished their meals and the waitstaff was clearing the tables, preparing for the end of the night. But then something unexpected happened. The woman, who had been so outspoken earlier, suddenly stood up from her table. Jordan, who had just finished clearing a nearby table, noticed her movement. He saw her make her way toward the manager's office in the back of the restaurant. She didn't look like someone who had been satisfied by the manager's earlier response. Her posture was straight, her steps purposeful. She wasn't done yet. Jordan hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. He could hear her muffled voice as she spoke with the manager behind the door. It sounded like she was arguing, and though the words were indistinct, the tone was clear. She was frustrated. He couldn't help but wonder what she was saying, but he knew he had to stay focused on his work. It wasn't his place to eavesdrop, no matter how curious he was about what was going on. The conversation behind the door went on for several minutes, the words rising and falling with the ebb and flow of the argument. Finally, the door opened and the woman stepped out. Her expression was a mix of frustration and something else, something harder, more resolved. She didn't look back as she walked past Jordan, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Jordan watched her leave, wondering what had happened. Had the manager agreed to give her what she wanted? Had he caved under the pressure? As many people in the service industry sometimes did, it didn't seem likely, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the air. The woman's mood had shifted and it didn't feel like it was in her favor. But just as quickly as she'd entered, the tension seemed to fade again. Jordan went back to clearing the tables and the restaurant slowly returned to its usual calm. But he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The woman had been difficult all evening, but there was something about her that made him uneasy, something he couldn't quite explain. As the last few guests finished up their meals and began to leave, Jordan began to clean the empty tables. He was almost done for the night, but before he could finish, the manager walked up to him, his expression unreadable. "Jordan," the manager said, his voice low. "Can you meet me in the office for a moment?" Jordan nodded, setting down the rag he was holding. "Of course, sir." When they entered the manager's office, the atmosphere was different. The woman's presence still lingered in the air, and Jordan could sense that the situation had escalated. The manager closed the door behind them and turned to face Jordan. "I wanted to fill you in on what just happened," the manager began, his tone calm but serious. "That woman, she's not just any customer. She's been a regular here for years, but her behavior tonight was out of line, even for her." Jordan raised an eyebrow, surprised by the manager's admission. "She's been here before?" "Many times," the manager replied, sitting down at his desk. "But tonight was different. She's never acted this way, not even close. And there's something else you should know." Jordan leaned forward, eager to understand more. "What's that?" The manager hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "The woman is connected to the ownership of this place, through someone she knows personally. She's not just any rich customer. She's someone who thinks she can get away with anything because of her connections. The words hit Jordan like a ton of bricks. He had known she was wealthy, of course, but he hadn't realized the full extent of her influence. It suddenly made sense why she'd been so confident, so dismissive. She wasn't just acting entitled. She believed that the world revolved around her, that she could dictate the rules of the game. But hearing that she was personally connected to the ownership made everything more complicated. The manager's words were a subtle warning. This wasn't just a bad customer. It was someone who had the potential to cause serious trouble if she didn't get what she wanted. So what happened? Jordan asked quietly, still processing the information. Did she get what she wanted? The manager shook his head. Not exactly. She tried to push her weight around, but I made it clear that we run things by a certain standard here. No one gets special treatment, no matter who they know. She wasn't happy about it, but I think she got the message. Jordan let out a small breath of relief. So you didn't back down? No, the manager said firmly. I wasn't going to let her intimidate me into changing things. We can't run this place based on who someone is connected to. It's not how we do things. Jordan nodded, feeling a sense of respect for the manager. It wasn't easy standing up to someone like that woman, especially when she had so much influence. But the manager had done what was right, and that gave Jordan a newfound appreciation for his leadership. That's good to hear, Jordan said, his voice steady. I was starting to wonder if she'd get away with it. I wasn't going to let that happen, the manager replied, his tone softening. But I wanted to make sure you understood the situation. People like her, they're used to getting their way. They believe their money gives them power, but they don't always realize that respect is earned, not bought. Jordan let the words sink in. The evening had started off as just another difficult shift, but it had turned into something much more. He had been tested both professionally and personally, and he had passed despite the woman's best attempts to belittle him. Before leaving the office, the manager clapped Jordan on the shoulder. You handled yourself well tonight. Don't let people like her get under your skin. You're doing great work here. Jordan smiled, grateful for the manager's support. Thanks, I appreciate it. As he left the office and made his way back to the dining area to finish cleaning, the weight of the evening began to lift. The woman's departure hadn't been as dramatic as he'd expected, but her behavior had left an impression. The restaurant, for all its elegance and prestige, had shown its true colors tonight. The manager had held his ground and Jordan had followed suit. In the end, it was a reminder that no matter how wealthy or powerful someone thought they were, respect had to go both ways. And as the last of the guests trickled out and the lights in the restaurant dimmed, Jordan couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. Tonight they had won. The night had finally come to a close. The last of the guests had left. The kitchen was clean and the lights dimmed in the restaurant. Jordan took a deep breath as he began wiping down the tables, his mind still on the events of the evening. The woman's visit had shaken him more than he cared to admit, and even though the night was over, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't just about the woman's attitude. It wasn't even about how she had treated him or the manager. It was the reminder that despite all the professionalism in the world, some people still believed they could get away with anything because of their wealth or connections. But as he wiped down the last table, he felt a small sense of pride. The manager had stood firm, and so had he. They had refused to bow down to her entitled behavior, and that was something he could hold on to. Just as he finished, the manager walked back into the room, his face more relaxed now that the night was done. He gave Jordan a friendly nod. You did great tonight, the manager said, his voice warm with approval. I know it wasn't easy, but you handled everything well. Jordan smiled, relieved to hear the praise. Thanks, it wasn't the easiest shift, but it worked out in the end, the manager chuckled. That's the thing about this job. Every night is a new challenge, but you learn to handle it no matter what's thrown at you. Jordan nodded, grateful for the wisdom. He had learned a lot tonight, not just about dealing with difficult customers, but about how to stand his ground when it mattered. As the last lights were turned off and the restaurant began to empty out, the manager turned to Jordan once more. I'll see you tomorrow. Get some rest, you earned it. Jordan headed for the door, his thoughts swirling as he stepped into the cool night air. He was tired, but it was the kind of tired that came from doing a job well. As he walked to his car, he couldn't help but think about the woman. Despite her attempts to belittle him, despite her sense of superiority, She had left without getting the best of him. She had been confident she could bend the rules, that her connections would give her the power to control everything. But in the end, the only thing she had controlled was her own downfall. The next morning, Jordan woke up feeling strangely calm. The events of the previous night seemed more distant now, as though they had been part of a different world. He made himself a quick breakfast, his mind still running over the conversation with the manager. The lesson he had learned was clear. People like that woman weren't as powerful as they thought they were. Money might buy you things, but it couldn't buy respect. Respect had to be earned, and that was something she had failed to realize. He arrived at the restaurant a little earlier than usual, ready to take on the new day. The morning shift was always a little quieter, a little more relaxed, but Jordan found that he liked it that way. It gave him time to prepare for the challenges of the evening. As he entered the restaurant, he was greeted by the familiar hum of activity. The staff was already getting ready for the dinner rush, setting the tables, arranging the silverware, and making sure everything was in order. Jordan made his way to the back, where the manager was standing near the kitchen. "Morning, Jordan," the manager said with a smile. "Ready for another busy night?" "Always," Jordan replied, his smile matching the manager's. Just then, one of the servers came up to them, holding a small envelope. She handed it to the manager with a polite but curious look. "What's this?" the manager asked, opening it. Jordan glanced over at him, intrigued. The manager unfolded the letter and read it quickly. His expression shifted slightly, but he didn't say anything at first. "Everything okay?" Jordan asked, sensing something was off. The manager glanced at him, his face neutral. "It's from the woman who was here last night." Jordan frowned, wondering what this was about. Had she come back to complain again? Had she tried to escalate things further? The manager held up the letter. "It's not a complaint, though. It's an apology." Jordan's eyebrows shot up. "An apology?" "Yes," the manager said, still reading the letter. "She's apologizing for her behavior. Says she was out of line and that she's embarrassed by how she acted. She also mentions she'll be recommending the restaurant to her friends, but only if we accept her apology." Jordan blinked, still processing the unexpected turn of events. "She actually apologized?" The manager nodded. "Yes, looks like she realized she crossed a line. It seems she respects how we handled things, even if it wasn't what she expected." Jordan felt a mix of surprise and disbelief. The woman who had been so rude and condescending the night before was now apologizing. It was hard to imagine. But then again, maybe this was part of the lesson he had learned. People were complex. Sometimes they needed a moment of reflection to realize their mistakes. "Well, what do we do now?" Jordan asked, still unsure how to respond. The manager thought for a moment before folding the letter back up. "We acknowledge it. I'll write her a response thanking her for her apology. We don't need to make a big deal out of it, but we can accept it graciously. It's the right thing to do." Jordan nodded, admiring the manager's calm response. He had handled the entire situation with grace, from the difficult confrontation to the woman's sudden change of heart. The manager had done what was necessary, never overreacting, never letting the situation spiral out of control. Later that evening, the woman did not return to the restaurant, but Jordan and the rest of the staff couldn't help but talk about the unexpected turn of events. They all knew that customers like her could be difficult, but they also knew that not every difficult customer would be as unreasonable as she had seemed. People were capable of change, capable of recognizing their mistakes. And as the days passed, Jordan found himself thinking less about the woman and more about his own growth. The experience had taught him something important, not just about customers and difficult situations, but about himself. He had stood up for what was right. He had kept his composure in the face of adversity. And most importantly, he had learned that respect was something everyone deserved, no matter their status or background. In the end, the woman had left not with a sense of victory, but with a lesson learned. And Jordan? He walked away knowing that he had done his best, that he had handled the situation with professionalism, and that in the face of someone's attempt to tear him down, he had stayed true to who he was. The restaurant continued to thrive, as it always had, with Jordan and his team working hard every night. And though that woman's presence was never felt again, the memory of her visit served as a reminder that no matter who you were, respect was always the most important thing.